Yeah, this is Fred Shell again, Shell Boats. This is a brief presentation on how not to sand when you're using fiberglass and epoxy on your plywood epoxy boats or any other epoxy and fiberglass project. There's a better way, and it's related to the traditional cabinet scraper of old. It's basically forming an edge on a metal tool, a kind of a square edge that will cut. And you have to keep forming that edge. Now, I've got two of the tools that I use often here. This little one is good for intense pressure in short areas. The other one is good for wide flat areas. And the basic idea is that you put this tool, traditional cabinet scraper, you'd use a burnishing tool, and you would hold this in a vise and rub it hard so that it forms a little bit of a curled edge, and that's the cutting edge. Now, this isn't fine cabinetry. This is fine boat building. I form the edge by using this. I'll show you in a minute. Use a grinding wheel to form the edge, and it makes a nice. You can feel it once you do it. It gets kind of a very rough, ragged edge. And with that edge, you see the white stuff come up now. This is the most difficult thing to do, because what we're doing is cutting glass here, the fiberglass cloth on its edge, where the selvage edge makes a bump. You'd like to get it as close to flush with the surface as possible. Down on a chine, I don't go crazy. I let the line show, but I don't like to have a harsh bump there. So with this tool, rather than sanding, you can run it across. And you can take off that edge. Now, with the tool about this size, you can do a pretty nice job on a section of chine, maybe 3 feet long. And then you got to sharpen it. That's a big bother, but it's not if you're set up for it. And when you compare it to the idea of using sandpaper and all the dust that it makes, and the cost of sandpaper, and the fact that it just doesn't work as well, I think we'll see that this is really a better alternative, at least for part of the preparation of an epoxy surface. Now, if you've worked with epoxy, you know that that first coat leaves kind of a hairy, rough surface, and you want to smooth that up. The second coat will be pretty nice and glossy, but not the first coat. Now, I use this big flat knife. I'm not sure. I hope you can see that with every stroke, there's a little pile of white curlies that come up here. And there's a basic thing about this that makes it so nice. And you don't want to gouge anywhere. You know, like it's sanding, especially with power tools, you're liable to gouge. But because this is a very stiff blade, so it lays down you push some pressure on it, it lays down flat on the surface. It doesn't dig in anywhere. It shaves off the high parts and just skids over the top of the low parts, which is ideal for taking that furry surface off of a freshly coated, freshly epoxy surface. Now this is, see, you can feel that, right? That's really soft, smooth. Compared, and this is like sandpaper up here. So this is an 18-foot catamaran that I'm working on the hulls for, and this makes the whole job of getting it smooth much easier. I'll be doing 2 coats of epoxy, 3 on the bottoms of the hulls with the tint. And after the first coat, I'll do this. And then after the second coat, I'll go over it with the same tool lightly, because there's always going to be some little bits and bumps and whatever, you know, of bits of sawdust that got in or whatever before painting. And virtually no sanding. I'll take a piece of sandpaper, like on a chine there. This doesn't work so well on a curved surface. You can take sandpaper to get the rounded edge. You know, just kind of finish it up just by hand. No power tools, because you're not taking much off. You're just smoothing the very top edges of the surface. So I'll show you how I put a new edge on my tool. This is the essential piece of heavy equipment that you need. Not heavy, this is the most basic bench grinder. So I bought for about 30 years ago, I think. And it doesn't take long. You're working, you come over, you turn this on. It takes a few seconds for it to get up. So you can really feel a cutting edge on there. It actually makes a nice square corner on both sides. Square corner on this side and a little curl on this side. And yeah, you can take the corner off a little bit so you don't gouge anywhere. But that's it. Takes, what, 20 seconds or something like that. And you walk back to the boat and do some more scraping with a nice edge. And so this is a surface that I have put a clear coat on, then I put 1 coat of a tinted epoxy on. And I'm going to do another coat of tinted epoxy. And this is pretty smooth now. But I just hit something here, it almost cut my finger. A little bit of sawdust or whatever. So that, but before I put this next coat on, I don't know if you can see that, but if I hit that, it just chips it right off flat. And it's a little bit, not taking much material off this thing. But anything that's a little bit high is going to come off. No sanding necessary. I might hit the chine again with a little bit of sandpaper, very gently. I don't really want to take much off at all. Just getting the high spots off. And that's my story. So don't buy all that sandpaper, buy a bench grinder instead. You can use it for other things too. It's great for making sparks. But when you get well, you know, bench grinder is good for a lot of things, sharpening tools and whatever. And they last forever. All these are joint knives, basically, is what they're called. Home Depot, etc. But they're not all created equally. There is a type that is a tempered steel that has kind of a grayish finish. You can see this one, you can, if it's new especially, you can really see your reflection in it. The other kind you can't. It's kind of a flat gray color. And they're even more springy. These are stiffer, but as I understand it now, in terms of materials, the big difference is that these are chrome plated. Chromium is, I forgot the number, but it's way up there in the hardness scale, way above steel, any of the hardest steels. So when you're doing that grinding and forming the edge, what you're doing is you're making a corner of chromium, which is, like I said, much stronger than tempered steel. So these are steel, of course, on the inside, but the surfaces are chromium, and that's what you cut with. So it's very important to get the right kind. You can do almost the same thing with the tempered steel, but they won't last. They won't stay sharp as long, and it just won't do as good a job. And the price difference is negligible. Again, especially when you compare it to buying quantities of sandpaper. Now you can take. I have multiple. I have like 5 of these cut to different shapes. And I cut them to shape on a bench grinder. Sometimes like I make a point for getting into a corner like that. I usually don't want to, but there are times when you have to get into a corner, and especially with epoxy, it's hard, and you get a little bit of something in there, and you want to knock it off. What are the choices? You can't really sand it off very well. You can get in there with a chisel and a hammer and chip it off, but just much needed. All right, just a few more points here. To do a proper job of scraping, the epoxy should be cured hard. Now that doesn't mean epoxy cures harder for weeks, but like the next day, if you've used fast hardener, it's going to be fine. The main thing is it's not gummy. If you can stick your fingernail into it, it's too soft. It needs to be like hard enough so that when you're scraping, it's scraping up powder, dry stuff. You'll see a difference if you try to do it too soon. The blade will gum up. Actually, it'll build up gum along the edge of the blade, and that's a sure sign that you haven't waited long enough to do this. You can't sand at that point either, so it's no, you just have to wait. Now, there's a couple of other things here. Like over screw heads, where I putty up over the screw heads, sometimes it's raised a little high, and I'll go over it with that curved, smaller tool very carefully so as to not get below the surface anywhere. Because the big advantage of this whole thing is that the flattened blade, especially the wide flat blade, if you got it down at a low angle, it won't gouge. And that's a big deal. It should be just taking stuff off the surface, which is what you want to do. So yeah, you keep the tool as flat as possible. You don't want to, of course, this will gouge, but it's easy, especially if you have a fairly wide one, and you keep the blade reasonably straight. The smaller curved tools are really great for some things. Concentrated areas where you have to take off quite a bit in one spot, but when you're doing the general scraping, it's better. Keep one tool at least that has a pretty close to straight blade, and when you're working it, generally keep it down pretty flat, and you won't do any gouging, and you'll take a lot of material off at once. And I was showing you how to sharpen it and how sometimes you have to sharpen it a lot. That's really about the fiberglass. I did the entire length of this boat, from one end to the other, 18 feet, with one sharpening of the blade. When I was doing the flat areas and not doing the fiberglass, but just shaving the epoxy surface. And when you're doing the shaving of these large areas, you can go both directions. I tend to push more than pull, but you can also pull back. It generally shaves pretty good. And even though you've ground the edge on wheel only in one direction. You don't grind, you don't flip it over and do the other side. You do it one side. Both edges have a pretty good cutting edge, and so you can turn it over, and you can go both directions. And you can't cut like this. You do have to have like at least a 45-degree angle, say, when it's shaving, and you can go much lower than that, especially when you're I think when you're pushing, they're not quite flat, and that's some advantage when you're concerned about gouging, getting a nice flat surface. And the other thing, I think it should be clear now, but when you're sharpening this blade, you're trying to keep it perpendicular, the grinding wheel perpendicular to the blade, like you're making a square end on the blade. You're not trying to make a chisel shape or a point, like you're not really sharpening it. You're more, you can almost say you're dulling it, but you're making a square edge there, not a blade. Okay, maybe that's enough. Have a go at it. See what you think.